What were you like 10 years ago? What did you look like 10 years ago? What were you wearing 10 years ago? What did you look like 20 years ago? What were the fashions during that time? How did you view the world? What were some of like the crises for you that you can think of, like, oh, that thing just ruined my life, and then you look back 20 years from then, what does that crises look like now? Think about that for just a minute. Because for me, I think back 10 years ago, and I was a very different person. 10 years ago, I had very different ideas about what reality was. I had different ideas about who God was. I had different ideas about what I should value and what I shouldn't. Anyone else there with me? I listened, Keith and I were listening to this podcast, and this guy basically said exactly what I was going to say this week. So we're just going to play the podcast. It's going to be really exciting. Kidding. But when I think back on my own journey, there are a bunch of moments where I had something new pop up. And I remember thinking, oh, that's beautiful. That's interesting. Oh, crap, what do I do? You have those moments? Like, you open the box, the thing, you see it now, and you can't unsee it. And I remember my whole journey through the spiritual journey has been one constant, oh, that box looks interesting. Let me open that one. Let me read about this thing. Let me read about that thing. And when you begin reading and digging deeper, you begin, oh, what do I know? What do I think? And everything shifts and changes. And so I want to make a very clear statement before I even begin the Art of Deconstruction today by saying that I'm 38. I've studied and studied and studied a lot about Jesus and the Bible. I've studied a lot about philosophy, done a lot of that. But at 28, I can tell you I was a very different person. And I have a feeling when I'm 48, I will look back and I will have grown even more. Are you with me? At 48, I have a feeling I'll look back and I'll say, oh yeah, I thought that. I also think this now. And this has been added to the layers. And so what's beautiful about growth, the evolution of each of us, is that no matter where we are, we're going to continue growing and continue expanding. And so I'm going to share some ideas today, and you may not agree with them. Is that all right? Are we in safe space? I like it that it's a little bit smaller group today because I can do this, and it's I'm looking at every one of you, and I don't think you're going to kill me. Pretty exciting. I don't think there's going to be any like serious any repercussions here, but I say all of that to say that we are all growing, we're all changing, we're all evolving, and we've all gotten to certain places because we've all opened certain boxes. And so today I'm going to open quite a few different boxes for you, and what you do with them is entirely up to you. So the Art of Deconstruction has been a lot of fun so far. Here are our values. We show up, we hold space, we ask how, we get interested. Those are the things that are guiding us. The Art of Deconstruction has been interesting, though, because the topics came from you. You were asking. And so here are the main topics we discussed. And so first, we talked about the Bible, how to read the Bible. How do you read a story about the flood, right? Do you take that literally? What happens when stories of Joshua, where, like, again, the earth or the sun stops rotating around the earth? You know, what do you do with those kind of things? Scientifically, we know that's not true. So what do you do? And so as we talked, we said, you know what? The stories are not history. That wasn't the point. The stories are there to provide meaning and understand the deeper understandings of their culture and their values. So we also understood that each story has a cycle in it, from life to death to captivity to resurrection, the story that you and I all experience on a monthly, daily, quarterly cycle. It's what we do. And so we also understood last week, I talked about my friend Ida. And her dad, he came from a Middle Eastern culture where he kind of messed up some words and phrases, because when he came over here, instead of the road to hell is paved with good intentions, he would just simply say, the road to hell is paved. And she grew up with that. And and when she heard it correctly, she was like, wait, what? It's paved with what? Because ideas shift with culture and time. Have you ever taken time and asked Ida about her family? It's hilarious. So funny. Yeah, do that. So ideas shift with time and the culture that they're in. And so again, we understood that the cross That whole idea of the idea of this redemption story was not the actual story. It's not how they viewed the thing. It's not how a Jewish person viewed it. We understood that we are not evil, fallen people that need a murder in order to be in right standing with each other and the divine. Isn't that nice to hear, by the way? You don't need to have something. Yeah, that's really good news. There you go. Like, we're going to pull it to the reality, the real good news. Original sin, we talked about that last week. That was not the point. I even gave you the interesting the quote right there from one of the great Jewish theologians. He says, "Original sin was never part of Jewish culture." And by the way, have any of you had time to like deeply think about this during the week? Oh, yeah. It's fun, isn't it? It shifts everything. The whole story. And again, what Keith just said, the good news becomes actual good news. It's really, really good news. We are originally blessed. We talked about that last week. And we also talked about how Jesus becomes the new picture, the symbol for Israel of what to do in the midst of hate and captivity. He becomes the symbol of the Lamb, right? The symbol of how to recycle hate with love. And so today, and by the way, all of that, extremely high view of humanity. It's an understanding that we're blessed. We have a gift of life. It's a restorative thing. We don't have to necessarily always sing songs about being evil, decrepit sinners who aren't worthy. It's that we're miraculous beings who are worthy of life, and our goal is to share it. What a great blessing, right? So we talked about that. That's our recap. Today we're going to talk about Jesus. How many of you have ever seen this guy? Interesting that, yeah. It's interesting that most of the pictures you see of Jesus, white man, good looking, he looks like he was present during Movember. Jesus, there he is, the Christ. And I have had an interesting relationship with Jesus. I grew up with an interesting version of Jesus. I was told that Jesus was perfect. He lived a perfect, sinless life. And so I'm supposed to be like Jesus. He also did some annoying things like walking on water, turning like water to wine. He did a bunch of the stuff. And I'm thinking, I'm supposed to do what Jesus did? Like, I can't even tie my own shoes. I can't even chew gum and walk at the same time. Like, what? Is that the point? He lived a sinless life. And so I remember, like, what do you do with this? Like, that's a pretty extreme, that's an extreme thing to move toward, isn't it? Like, that seems pretty unbearable. And then I began to understand what sin was. Sin was not some weird covering that's on me because someone ate the wrong produce at one point in time. I began to understand, well, sin is actually the idea that being a sinner was to be ostracized, marginalized away from community. And then I began to understand, Jesus became marginalized. He walked with the marginalized so that we, the marginalized, could walk with him in solidarity. I began to understand that, and that shifted. But then I started to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are the Gospels. Started reading those, and I had some questions because I started to realize, like, Matthew and Luke talk about the birth story, but they're different versions. One of them has them going to Egypt. The other one has them going away from Egypt. And I'm like, well, which one is it? One of them tells a very different story. One's more about Herod. The other one's more about them as a couple, and they're leaving their community because they're fearful. The whole thing, like, it didn't measure up. I'm thinking, what happened? Why can't those authors agree? Isn't it the same story? Then I also remember, hearing, like, Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane. Check this out. He's praying, and he's by himself, isn't he? He's by himself. Who's writing this? Who was with him? Like, who was in the shadows? Like, hey, Jesus, can you say that one more time? I didn't quite hear what you just muttered in your prayer. Like, speak up. I'm like, what is, if this is literal history, perfect fact of exactly what happened, how's this going? And then I also remember hearing about, like, Pilate and his wife in their bedroom. And she comes in, probably in her, bathrobe or whatever they wear or don't wear. She comes in and she says, I had a dream. And they start to have this conversation. It's all written down. I'm thinking, who is the investigative reporter on that one? Like, who was sitting in their room during that time writing that down? And all of this, I remember thinking, like, the ascension. He's going up in the air like a balloon. And I keep thinking, where? Is he on a cloud literally looking down with a with a notepad? Like what? The whole thing started to shift, and I had all these questions, and I did not know what to do with them. And here's the interesting thing. I just opened up a bunch of questions for you. And some of you are thinking, I don't know. Here's the thing about certainty. It's really sexy and appealing, but certainty is dangerous. Certainty does not cause growth. Uncertainty does. Stepping into the questions, asking the questions, that's where growth is. And so I'm going to offer up a bunch of different things to you to consider today. And you may walk away thinking, I don't know what to think. And if that's you, you're in really good company. I am going to leave you with some great challenges to consider and how to better your life, because that's really why we're here. But we're going to talk about Jesus. Here's the thing about Jesus. He was Jewish. And for some of you in this room, let me go back. For some of you in this room, you bounce between 4 different ideas of Jesus. And here's what I love about this group. Not many of us agree completely on who Jesus was. Are you guys aware of that? Like in this room, it's really fascinating. There are people who they kind of bounce between 4 different perspectives of Jesus. So I'm going to share with you those 4. And I'm not going to tell you one is right, wrong, or whatever. I'm just going to share with you the different perspectives of Jesus. One is this: Jesus was a man. He was an actual Jewish rabbi whose teachings on enemy love, forgiveness, acceptance, peace, all of this changed the Western world. That's one perspective of Jesus. Now, it's interesting, when you look at Jesus historically, much of what he says is actually a reflection of another rabbi that came before Jesus. His name was Hillel. And so many people who believe Jesus was just a man, they'll talk about this and how there was Hillel and there was Shammai. Weird to have like the country split between 2 different divisions, right? So when people would ask Jesus, what do you think about this? They were actually saying, do you believe Hillel's teachings or Shammai's? I remember once when you're reading, you'll come across this one point where Jesus is asked about the law, and he's asked to sum up the law, which was a really normal thing for a rabbi to do. He quotes Hillel, a rabbi who had the same question asked of him. And Hillel, the more progressive liberal one, he says, love the Lord your God and love your enemy. Isn't that interesting? Jesus quotes Hillel. He sides with actually the more liberal side. That's why we like Jesus here. It's a raging liberal. Yeah. Messing. So there's that perspective. There's the perspective he was God, and this is probably 99% of Christians today. He is God in flesh who came to the world, reset the balance between right and wrong. He is literally part of this and depending on which tradition you're from, often we'll have the Godhead, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and literal beings. And these beings, again, are, Jesus would be up there, Holy Spirit would be here. God the Father, we're not so sure what to do with, depending on the tradition you're from. He's either a white middle-aged man up there or omnipresent, omniscient. Those are different perspectives of God. And again, here at Ethos, we have many different perspectives on how we talk about the divine. And so, again, Jesus becomes the divine picture of literally God, a theistic version of God. So there's that perspective, which many of you are familiar with. Here's another perspective. Jesus is a created myth, like the story of Job. And I've heard many people talk about Jesus in this way. They'll talk about the connections between Horus, Attis, Mitha, all these different connections. Again, Horus, born on the 25th, born from a virgin. There's a star in the east. Many of these different individuals from different gods, from the Greeks, the Persians, India, all these different ones. Oftentimes they will die. They'll be in the ground 3 days. They'll have a resurrection. Am I throwing anybody off yet? It's all interesting stuff. And so many people who buy into kind of fit more with the myth, this is where they'll oftentimes go. Jesus as myth. And there are some who believe that here. And then others, my friend Jason, I told him I was going to talk about him. He's not here yet. But Jesus, for some, is more of the mystery of life. This is a very mystical way of talking about Jesus, by the way. The mystery of life more abundantly, the gospel message that resides in each of us. It's like this power thing, and Jesus is in me, is in you, and it's a very mystical kind of approach to Jesus. And so when you talk about Jesus, people will ask me, well, what do you believe? Do you know that's the main question most people ask me? here at this committee, well, what do you believe about Jesus? And I'll say, well, which Jesus? I'll say, what? Because for Jesus, there have been many different ideas about how to view Jesus. And in 1910 is actually the first time they actually nailed down the 5 different beliefs about Jesus. Did you know it's been only since 1910? Yeah, 1910 they said, okay, Jesus is definitely God. The Bible is inerrant, infallible. They began to write all of these concepts down. And they said, you have to do this because there were others they were uncomfortable with and they felt were blasphemers. So they created that in 1910. Interesting? Yeah, look it up, the 5 fundamentals. You'll find it there. So these are different perspectives of Jesus. And I want to make it very, very clear from the get-go, 4 different perspectives of Jesus, and all are welcome here. You're all welcome here. How's that feel? Yeah. So here we go. Jesus, it turns out, was Jewish. So if you hate Jews, you're probably going to have a problem with Jesus. Because from the get-go, Jesus was actually a Jewish person. From the get-go, whether, again, God, mystery, man, myth, whatever it was, it's all framed in Judaism. So it's so important from the get-go to understand Jesus was Jewish. So what I want to do for you is this. I want to play with felts publicly because I do it in private often. I want to share with you some interesting things. I might need like a handheld mic for this while I'm doing it, but I'm going to play with felts for a moment, and I'm going to share with you the bigger picture of Judaism, and then I'm going to go through a concept called the Messianic archetype. But I want you to first understand Judaism and how they view the whole thing. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to pull up my felt board, and I'm going to play with some felts, and it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, so for Judaism, the whole story revolved around this concept. It revolved around their history and where they were going. So how many of you know what this is? It's a church. Why do we gather oftentimes to churches? Why do we go to these places? Who decided way back then it's got to look like this? Okay, we're used to it. Some people will even go as far as to say, if you don't have something that looks like this, then you can't have a spiritual experience. They'll say that. If it doesn't look like this, if you don't go into a place and you dress a certain way and you do certain ritual, then you can't actually experience the thing. For the Jewish people, that's what they called their temple, and it was very important to them. And so everywhere they went, they built the thing called the temple. And so the temple for them is where all religious stuff came from. It's where it all centered around. And so if the temple's gone, your religious experience is gone. If this space burned down to the ground and everything just revolved around the space, your whole experience, what do you do? Where do you gather? Do you gather at all? Is the whole thing dead? Those are the questions that would be asked. And so here's the thing. They have a temple. And people would gather. Look at this. Oh, this is bringing back so many good memories. Look at that. They're gathering. The ladies. Yeah, right. Can't we go? Oh, this is so good. There's so many good felts here. My parents used to teach every single week. They would teach the children with felts. And I feel like kids today don't get that opportunity anymore. It's just like, we're going to play VeggieTales. My parents, they would pull these things out and they'd be like, hello, Mary, how are you? And my mom's voice, like, hello. And it was weird stuff that torments me at night still. I have dreams. And so, anyways, Israel, they leave their tribe, and some believe that it was actually the Assyrian tribe. Some believe it was even further out. But either way, they decide we're going to leave the tribe we're in, and we're going to walk into a new kind of reality. We're going to do our own traditions. We're going to do our own stuff. Doesn't that sound nuts? So they decide that's what they're going to do. We're going to try something completely, totally different. We're going to be a people who aren't always just warring and needing to gather. We're going to be even nomadic people. But they finally build their temple. And what happens after they build their temple, years later, this group called the Egyptians come along, and they destroy it. And so the temple is destroyed, and the people are asking the question, what do we do? What do we do? Caroline's walking in like, Caroline's like, why are we playing with felts? So their temple's destroyed. The people have no temple. What do we do? Where do we gather? What do we do? And so what they do is they begin to tell the story of Job. Job is the oldest story in the Old Testament. They begin telling the story because in the story of Job, it actually answers the question, where is God and where is community when bad things happen? And is there life after this? Anyone with me? Yeah. Okay, good. So then, years later, some more people gather. That's just a weird one. Is that David? I'm not sure. You always have lots of Jesus, though, with like the red sash. You're never short of Jesus with felts. And then they have all these other people gather. And they have a new gathering place, and they call it a temple. And that temple now is in the middle of Babylon. Because what happened, Babylonians, basically, they see a temple, they come in and they destroy the Jewish temple again. And they are marched hundreds of miles on foot, and they're asking the question, what do we do? Their temple's destroyed again. Are you getting a theme? Look what they do. When we experience tragedy, what do? When someone dies, what will we often do at the funeral? Mourn. What will happen in the conversations around the room? We'll remember. Let's be honest. Some of the stories we tell, they get bigger over time, don't they? Give it a year, and the fish Tony caught that one day was actually a whale. The thing that happened was way more extraordinary than it sounded like. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? The stories build and build and build, and what you have is, in Babylonian exile, when their temple is destroyed, and they're asking the question, is there life after this? Where's this going? They look back, and they tell the stories now, not of Job, but the stories of Egypt. The stories about Moses. Do you guys see it? A people who are in captivity, broken, they're asking, where's life after this? Is there life? You follow a little bit further. You have another group of people. They're the same people. They're Jewish. We didn't have many ladies there. Here are the ladies. The ladies. And this guy. And so, here's what happens next. The Jewish people, they figure out a way to survive, and their narrative brings them along. But what happens is, there's this Greece, this empire of Greece. And, that's not funny, there's Greece. The empire of Greece. They come along and they see the temple, and what they do is they conquer Israel again. And there's this thing called the abomination of desolation. It sounds really interesting. It's in the Bible. People oftentimes will try to say like, oh, this is like this event or this event. It actually meant something for the Jewish people. Because what happened is their general walks into their temple and he sacrifices a pig. And if you're a Jew, a pig is like the most foul thing you could ever have. You never walked with it. You don't touch it. It's unclean. And what the general did is he sacrificed a pig in their temple, which means that temple could never be used again. Right? Their temple is then destroyed. Guess what story they tell? They already told the ones about the Egyptians. What story are they telling now? They're looking back at Babylon. And what story do you suppose is the story during the time of Jesus? The story of Daniel. They were looking for another Daniel. Daniel in the middle of Babylon. Daniel, the one who learned how to live fully free in the middle of captivity, how to reorder the world. Is anyone thinking this is interesting but me? Is this cool? So watch this. Every single time they have a catastrophe and their temple is destroyed, the narrative, the story, is the thing that holds their people together and gives them hope. That's why speeches and poems and stories are so valuable to us. And then this happens. Rome, one of the largest military forces in the world, steps in and they conquer Israel and all the other neighboring tribes. Israel has their temple. And during the time of Jesus, they lived at a time where they could still have their temple. But in 70 AD, their temple is destroyed by the Romans. What is the central picture for them now of what brings life in the middle of brokenness? What story is it that becomes the story? Before it was Daniel. Now who is it? Yeah, Jesus. Watch this. You're going to get this. Some of you who are Bible thumpers. Jesus becomes the symbol of the temple. Jesus reminds us what a walking, living, breathing temple looks like. You don't need the temple anymore. This is the picture of what brings life. This way of life is what we need. And so there's a death and there's a resurrection and there is a reminder that there is life after this. Is anyone following me on this? For a Jewish person, that's their story. And if you are a Jewish person, when you're reading the stories in the Bible, every single story is going to revolve around life after brokenness. And so for the Jews, they have this thing called a messianic archetype. Everyone say messianic archetype. Your intelligence barometer just went up. You're all brilliant. Every single story has a messianic archetype. This was a Jewish form of writing, and they always had a certain person that the story revolved around. And so again, I'm going somewhere. Let me go there quickly with you. The messianic archetype, this is the purpose of that person in the story. And I'm not saying they're not real or they are real or they're mystery, man, whatever. I'm saying listen to the purpose behind it. You choose. It's going to be choose your own adventure. It's going to be like eating, it's like a sushi bar. You can choose whatever you want as it comes across. But here you go. Messiah reorders the world. That's what the messianic figure does. And so here's Adam. He's naked. He's a felt, so it's okay. Adam. After Adam's God steps in and brings order from the chaos, he calls Adam, he, she, it, the divine, calls Adam to begin ordering the world, right? And so there's Eve. She's a felt. Don't get too. She's naked. That's what they do. Back then, it was entirely appropriate. Then they start naming things. So they begin with cat, and, it's the beginning. It's the start. It's not perfect. It's cat. It's not the greatest pet in the world, is it? They don't care if you live or die, just as long as there's food. Cat. They name it cat. Next, we have anteater, which was, big whoop. It's eating ants. That was very creative there, Adam. Anteater. Fox. They saw this interesting animal and they thought, fox. And then they listened to what it had to say. And now we know what the fox says. They had a yellow creature. They called it a giraffe. We still don't know what it says. And then we had dog, which backwards is God, which is the most divine pet ever. And they reorder life together. And that was the point. Adam and Eve, they are learning to order life, using the wisdom and the knowledge that was there given to them. We understand through the story they choose not to allow wisdom to steer their knowledge, and they end up with fig trees, fig leaves all over them. Got it. So next, again, the messianic archetype brings order from chaos. That was the point. When a Jewish person read the story of Adam and Eve, it was not about a fall, and now you have the sinful stain and this and that and that. That wasn't the point. It was, how do we bring order from chaos? Here's two individuals that attempted to do it. And so it's interesting when you hear about Jesus, you'll often hear about Adam. He was the next Adam, right? The one who is to bring order from chaos. And notice this, there is a pattern. For Jewish people, when they read the story, they saw a pattern emerge. Here's Jonah. Anyone ever think this is like a weird story? I'm really angry with you guys. I'm going to flood the world. Like, that seems extreme, right? I was told over and over again by my parents, well, it's because it was really bad. Like, how bad could it have been? Like, why? Why flood the whole world? Apparently the world is flooded. There's chaos. And watch this. From the chaos comes the dove that brings peace. And Noah is called to reorder the world. Tracking? Reorder the world. Abraham brings his people from this chaotic empire into a new order, a new way of life. It's actually told that Abraham's father in the Talmud was an idol maker, which is interesting. He leaves his old tribe, steps into the new, brings order into this new community. And again, I find it really interesting. He and Joseph and Mary look very similar, don't they? They leave this certain place. They go to Egypt for a time. They come back. It's a very interesting story, a pattern over and over again. Abraham. Then you have Jacob. Jacob leaves his father's house, goes into exile in the where? The desert, right? Of course, that's where everything happens. In the desert, he comes out with a new name. He begins reordering life. We have the same thing with Elijah and like Elijah 2.0, Elisha. They do a very similar thing here. They go into the wilderness. They call their people into a reordering of life. You can find, again, Israel's story deeply embedded in there. And then you have Daniel. Daniel helps his people, again, in the middle of captivity. How do we reorder life? How do we find life more abundantly? How do we keep this thing alive? That was the story of Daniel, a messianic figure. And again, he goes down into the pit. When you go into a pit of lions, how are you going to fare? Well, not so well. Yeah, you're going to die, right? Yeah, you're lunch. You're dead. The idea is he comes out of the pit, life. Though we're in the pit, in the brokenness and death, there is life on the other side in the morning. Anyone hearing a theme yet? Yes, so good. Here's Joseph. He has a dream. He has a vision. He shares the dream with his brothers who don't like it. Follow me now. He's thrown into a pit, left to die. He's taken to Egypt. He prepares the way for his family to prosper in Egypt. Anyone hear that one? I feel like there's another story about another Joseph and his wife who go to Egypt. And they're in Egypt. They take their son in order to escape death, and they have to reorder life again. Interesting. If you're a Jewish person, when you read that, Joseph is Joseph. You see the connections. Moses. How many of you have ever read stories of Moses? How many of you saw the terrible Ten Commandments movie? What was that dude's name? He was like NRA. Who was it? Who? Charlton Heston. Thank you. Head of the NRA. Good. And apparently a Moses 2.0 as well. Moses, interestingly enough, there is a moment when Moses is born and all the babies are killed. Anyone ever asked the question when you were little, like, why didn't God save all the babies? Why just the one? That seems mean. That doesn't. Why all of them? Moses, all the babies are murdered there, right, by the Pharaoh. And again, notice when Jesus is born, what story do they share? Well, of course, yeah, all the babies. Herod kills all the male babies, right? And again, understand, in the little town that he would have been born, that would have been about maybe 80 people. So as many, I don't know, maybe 5 babies. But just kind of keep in mind, there's a connection being made here. Moses brings people from chaos into order. That was the point. When Moses' life is in danger, he flees from Egypt to Israel. Notice for Jesus, it's the reverse. Again, they're picking up these themes. Just as Moses goes into the mountain, watch this, he receives the law, right? After he spends time in the desert, he then goes up the mountain and he gets the 10 Commandments. After Jesus is in the wilderness, the desert, for how many days? 40 days. Just like Israel, just like Moses. After that, where does he go right away? He goes up a mountain and he talks about the 10 Commandments. Is this fun? Yeah, because if you were Jewish and were reading this, you'd be like, holy crap, he's the next Moses. This is really cool. Wow, this is what they're trying to say. Over and over again, you'll see, and I can put some of these notes in a file for you, but Jesus and Moses, the obvious connections are there over and over again. There's even this tradition that says that when Moses dies, the heavens shook, lightnings flashed, a heavenly voice shook the earth, and dead people rose. Where have we heard that from before? Again, interesting connections all throughout the story. If you're a Jewish person and you're reading this, you are making interesting connections. Jesus is that next messianic archetype that's going to lead you somewhere. After Moses, we have this guy, Jonah. It's interesting in our culture, Jonah becomes like a kind of the anti-hero. How many of you ever grew up with that? Like Jonah's the bad prophet. Jonah missed it. He was bad. For a Jewish audience, Jonah's actually a hero. Fascinating. Jonah, here's what happens. He reaches out to Israel's enemy to offer forgiveness. He dies, right? He's thrown overboard. And the word there is he goes down to Sheol. The word means death. How many days after? 3 days later, he comes out of the sea and he's able to share the fullness of his message to both his people and his enemies. Cool? Yeah. Joshua, did you know the word Jesus is not what they would have called him? Jesus is a Roman name. Jesus' actual name was Joshua. So when you are a Jewish person, you're reading about Jesus, Joshua, you're remembering this guy who led your people through the Jordan River into a new way of ordering life. Where is it that Jesus is baptized, by the way? In the Jordan River. Every single time something interesting happens with a messianic archetype, almost every time they're moving their people, there's water and there's a parting of water involved. Moses, the waters part. Elijah, Elisha, the waters part. Joshua, the waters part. What happens at Jesus' birth, or at his baptism? It says the firmaments. They believed that up there was water, right? And what parts? The firmament, the water parts. It's so interesting. All these archetypes. David, he brings his people from chaotic war into a new order and a new empire. Interestingly enough, Jesus and David, born in Bethlehem. Star of David, where is that found in the story of the birth of Jesus? Well, it's right overhead. Why are they incorporating that in the story? They want you to make some connections. He's visited by wise men to confirm Jesus is the new ruler. Who visits David? At the same time, there's already another king and anoints him. Yeah, Samuel. Good. Do you guys see the connections here? Let me keep moving. Every single one of these messianic archetypes all throughout the Bible, all of them share very similar stories. They all share similar stories. And actually, the New Testament refers to every single one of them over and over and over again. The writers want you to know Jesus, for them, is the next messianic archetype. The Jesus story is the one that's going to sustain us now that the temple has been destroyed. I want to stop for a minute, and I just want to ask, do you have any questions? I just gave you a ton of information, and I apologize. You know what? I don't apologize. I don't apologize for a second. I think that's fun. But there's a lot to soak in, right? I just gave you a ton. Like, you could be Jewish now. You're Jewish. Oh, what do you think? Any questions or thoughts coming up right now after I just soaked you with a bunch of Jewish history and ways to read the Bible?
Is that the reason why Jewish people they don't believe in Jesus?
Okay, so the question was, is that why the Jewish people don't believe in Jesus? I would say many of them do believe in Jesus, but what do they believe about Jesus is the question. Many of them bounce back and forth between all four of what you folks think. Most of them would not say Jesus was God, because for a Jewish person to say that that's what God looks like us, a man, would be idolatry. So they would totally shy away from that, just to be very honest with you. The idea that Jesus would have a more divine spirit within him more than others is a very normal idea if you believe Jesus was a messianic archetype, a Messiah who was going to lead your people like Moses did out of Roman Empire. So all of that to say, yeah, they did and they didn't. Yeah. Good question.
Is the origination of the Messianic archetype, is it from Judaism, Christian, or is it?
Oh, good.
Keystone. Where does it start?
Messianic archetype, you can find it in Judaism and their literature, but you can actually find it in Egyptian literature, which is far older. You can find it in Assyrian, Babylonian. There's always one person who seems to bring their community and reorder things. The thing about the Jewish archetypes is that very rarely do they center it around destruction and chaos. Whereas Babylon, Rome, Greece, most of those archetypes, what they would do is they would step into order and they would bring chaos. And that chaos, that warring, would actually give them dominion. And so it's really interesting that Israel's archetypes, their Messiah figures, are different because they have a different way of ordering the world, which is really kind of fascinating. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? When you are a peaceful, nomadic people who just want to do their own thing, again, we would have no illustrations of that in our society today, would we? But you want to just do your own thing. You want to live your own way. You want to just be you. You will find that there are some beastly empires that they just want more land, more resources, and they're willing to go over to anywhere to take great lengths to take your, I don't know, let me just throw a couple, oil. And so Judaism was very different. And so it's very easy, this nomadic people, to be taken captive over and over and over again, especially when they were attempting to be peaceful people. Good. Any other questions before I begin? Continue. Good. All right. Let me keep going. So it's interesting. How does Jesus refer to himself? Did you ever stop to think about that? Because in our culture, we have different ways of referring to Jesus. But what does Jesus call himself? Did you ever think that might be an interesting thing to consider? Jesus said this. He said, I am the Son of Man, who has come to save that which was lost. The word Son of Man is the most common over and over and over again, is what Jesus calls himself. Son of God was a Roman term that was used on emperors as well as any officials that they felt were divine or from the gods or demigods. Romans would use Son of God. And that's why you find that actually in our translations sometimes. But the word that actually Jesus over and over and over again refers to himself as the Son of Man. That phrase means this: the fully human one. Now, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying, see, he's just a man, or see, he's a mystery, or this or that. Here's what I'm saying. The phrase actually means this: I encompass all of what humanity could be. Oh, I just feel like I'm alone sometimes. Isn't that beautiful? Like, I encompass all of what humanity could be. When I walk around, everywhere I go, I bring life. Think about this. When's the last time you were sitting down with coffee with someone and you left and you thought, nailed it. They're pretty sure I'm God. Like, I'm pretty sure they're saying awesome things about me. They're probably writing up a Facebook thing right now about how great I am. Like, but that's what happens everywhere Jesus goes. He embodies the fullness of what humanity can be. And that's why, again, at the end of the Gospels, Jesus says, you will do greater things than me. Because it's not about walking on water. It's not about turning water into wine. It's about learning to embody basically all the goodness of humanity and sharing that with others. I feel like that's a little more doable than turning water into wine, right? Interesting. He calls himself the Son of Man, the one that embodies humanity fully. And again, this would make no sense if you believed we are all inerrantly bad and we need a murder, right? Jesus' comment about himself would make no sense. He says this: but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. There's this word righteousness. I used to think that righteousness meant like you don't sin anymore, you don't do anything bad ever again. Well, good luck, right? You'll never miss the mark again, never the point. Here's what righteousness means. It means this: right standing. Right standing with the environment and the world around you. Right standing with God, your parents, your enemies. Right standing Isn't that interesting? Jesus brings this idea over and over again. The way to reorder the world is through love, forgiveness. It's through humility. It's through bringing the orphan, the stranger, the widow, the marginalized here and learning to walk with them. It's standing up for those people. It's walking with them. And when you do that, righteousness is right there with you. You actually learn to embody right standing everywhere you go. Anyone dig that? It's beautiful. Let me ask this question. Actually, let me go back. Right standing. No, I'm going to go there. I want you to close your eyes for a minute. Just close your eyes. This is not to give you guilt or shame, not to make you feel bad, but we're here to learn to be better humans, to fully encompass, to embody what Jesus said means to be fully human. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to think right now in your life, what is not in right standing? Are there relationships that need to be mended or cut off? Are there people in your life that are toxic, that keep bringing you more and more pain? Does that relationship need to end? How do you need to reorder life so that you can experience it more fully? Is there someone in your life right now that you may have offended or hurt? Do you need to talk to them and have that crucial conversation? Are there certain things you keep falling back to, certain behaviors that keep putting you over and over again in really bad places? What is not in right standing? Because right now you have an opportunity to reorder life. And that's actually a gift. So right now, just keep your eyes closed. Think about where in your life do some things just need to be rearranged, reordered. You can open your eyes. The message of Jesus for me is over and over and over again. There's a new way of ordering the world. There's a new way of living life more abundantly. And it's found in the way he lived and walked and lived and breathed, the way he loved his enemies, the way he showed humility. Over and over again, there is that message. There is a new way of ordering the world. And here's the beauty of that. I see that messianic archetype. It didn't actually stop there with Daniel, did it? It didn't stop with Joshua. What I see are there are these amazing people who seem to just come out from nowhere, and they start living and sharing that message. And I love that the message is not simply just in Christianity, don't you? When you look, you can find it. You can find it in Mahatma Gandhi, can't you? There's a new way of reordering the world. Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama, all of these different individuals, and there's more. But there is a new way of reordering the world. And it almost every single time, it always centers on learning to embody goodness and walk with love and forgiveness and hospitality. It's about peaceful resistance. It's not about turning and escalating more violence. So nowadays, I'm learning to reorder life. And people ask me this all the time. Who is Jesus? What do you do with Jesus? So here's my perspective. Here's my perspective right now. I stopped worshiping Jesus and I started following Jesus. I stopped spending all of my time worshiping Jesus and I started taking Jesus seriously. It's very easy to worship things and create rituals. Those are easy. It's easy to create a bunch of dogmas and doctrines of who's in, who's out. But it's much harder to live those things out. And so for me lately, my heart has been in, how do I follow Jesus? And when I start following Jesus, what's weird is as I'm walking, I begin noticing all these other people who I never would have thought we're following in the same footsteps. I'll talk to my Muslim friends, which I have 2 of. Got to work on that. Talk to my Buddhist friends, my Catholic friends, my extreme conservative friends. And I'll find that when we start making that our focus, we start walking together and we begin living a very different kind of life. And everywhere we go, here's the beauty. Over and over again, Jesus says, my body is this temple. He actually said, he said there in John chapter 2, for anyone that's looking at their Bibles, he said, destroy the temple and in 3 days, I will raise it again. What's really fascinating about that is this. To a people who already lost their temple, the message is, even though you're in pain and you're in brokenness, there's resurrection again. Even though things keep crumbling all around you, even though certain relationships end, certain things keep falling apart, whatever it is, you have this beautiful gift, this beautiful opportunity to hold on to hope and to know that you have the blessing of reordering life again. I know it's not easy to say that in the middle of the thing that happened. The divorce, the breakup, the job loss, the accident, the death, whatever the thing is. It's not easy to say this, but there's a very beautiful truth to the temple, and it's this. Though all of the bricks are now scattered on the ground, everything seems to be completely out of whack. You have the power and the ability to start picking up those bricks and building a new thing. And here's what Jesus says, it's even more crazy. He says, leave the flipping bricks. Become the thing. And now become the mobile thing. Walk around and bring it to everyone you meet. Right? Be the thing. And so Jesus, for me, has become so much bigger, so much more encompassing, and so much more powerful. And that's why when people ask me, why do you talk about Jesus? This is my answer. I find Jesus to be one of the most compelling figures to ever live. Or I'm trying to think how to fit with all the different people in the room. I'll just say one of the most compelling figures ever. Because the story of Jesus over and over again causes me and everyone I know to want to be better humans and to encompass that reality everywhere they go. So that is my discussion on Jesus. And I purposely left a little bit of time where if there are other questions now's a great time to ask. Any questions over what we just talked about? Anything surface for you? I find it really fascinating. And again, I was a praise and worship leader, y'all. That's what I did for a living for quite a while. If 28-year-old me heard me at 38 saying this, I'd probably punch myself in the throat. I'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, you're an idiot. But I started studying, like, where does Jesus say worship him? Like, where does that whole thing come from? And I began understanding, like, that whole idea was a very Roman idea to start worshiping. Jesus never once says worship me. You know what he says? Follow me. Like, do the things I do. But what is the majority of Christianity doing right now? We're really good at worshiping and we're really terrible at following. Why is it that 40% of the guns in the world are owned here in America? Why is it that we own 90+% of the world's nukes? Why is it that we are the biggest producers, and again, how you view pornography, whatever. Why are we the biggest producers of pornography? And why is it in the Bible Belt is where we consume it the most? We're great at worshiping and we're terrible at following, at living it fully. And so, yeah, that's why for me, I have a lot more time to start focusing on following Jesus. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. So for anyone listening that didn't hear that, Kim said she loves the idea. Jesus says, you will do greater things than me, because not just me as a singular person, but as a whole, a collective, we have the opportunity as a collective to do something even greater because there's more, right? We can take that message and we actually live it out. And that's where it's not about building up this room. It's actually just about helping build up better human beings. That's the beauty of it. Beautiful.